Thank you all for joining us. How many here were here in the session about an hour ago? Were the same filled seats? Great. So it really does feel like a nice pairing of conversation. I'll give a little bit of framing, and then I want to introduce our panel, and we're going to have a great conversation here. This is also the 75th anniversary of the Aspen Institute, and when I think about the stories that are being told in other parts of the programming, when we think about what was happening, what did I think that Walter Isaacson yesterday said that there was the big bang of institutions post-World War II. One of those was the Global Agreement on Tariff and Trade that had just put into being post-World War II. The other, with one of the aspects of Bretton Woods, was that the global monetary system was the first time that they put that on the US dollar. And there was the beginning of a sense of, while there was other things going on in terms of the geopolitics of the time, there was a sense of building some new rails for a new era of globalization and prosperity. This is a moment when we're having the deep conversations about what has that arc taken us to? What is the state of that, both the economy and our understanding of what drives prosperity? And importantly, if a lot of that is rapidly changing at the moment, how do we think about it and how do we change it? So, and how do we grapple with the moment? So to join us this afternoon, if the last panel that was sitting here was a set of incredible leaders of finance and capital markets, here we have an incredibly thoughtful set of economists who can double-click into every single aspect of the conversations that we've been having around globalization and prosperity. And it's my job to try to wrangle it into one wonderful conversation. But just to kind of go down the line in terms of who's here, to my far left, and you're right, is Nancy Lazar. And for those of you who don't know her, she's a delight of a real stable part of the Aspen Institute community here, and provides a lot of provocative and really pragmatic insights. She's the chief global economist at Piper Sandler, and it's been fascinating as we prepared for this, getting her take on manufacturing and where we're at in America today. So thank you for joining us. To Nancy's right, yes, is Ian Fletcher. And he's an economist and an advisor for the Coalition for Prosperous America. His book is in the back. He is, and it's called Industrial Policy for the United States, Winning the Competition for Good Jobs in High-Value Industries.
In Italy, where I grew up, and my formative years as a teenager were the 70s, when we had these two major stagflation episodes, the Yom Kippur War between Israel and the Arab states that led to a recession, 74, 75, and then the Islamic Revolution in Iran that led then another oil shock price, another double-dip recession, 80, 82. So I don't know, I think that by the age of 14, I already knew that I was going to become a global macroeconomist. and I've done only that all my life. I've never had any other job, whether in academia or policy or in economic advice and so on. So I knew I wanted to understand the world and maybe change it also for the better. So not just an ivory tower academic, but also eventually get involved into policy and public intellectual as well. So I got lucky. By 14, I knew what I wanted to do.
It strikes me that this is a very global set of stories about where you come from, where your families come from, and at the essence of this conversation about globalization in trade. Each of you have a pretty pointed point of view on how that has benefited and how that has harmed America. And yet we're all here and thinking in somewhat optimistic ways about the future with conditions. So I wonder if we might each unpack a little bit of that your position on this issue of globalization's benefits and the limitations in terms of how we've gotten to a place now where this is in a moment we'll get to the tariff and the trade conversation. But how have we gotten to a place where there is a strengthening critique, and one would say even a public backlash that is coming to fruition in many ways, very powerfully around globalization? I want to start in the middle, Ian, with you. And I think interestingly, you might be in the middle of this conversation. So why don't we start with you, and then we'll figure out where that pivots to best.
I would say that the real question isn't globalization. The real question is free trade, because that's an actual policy decision. Globalization means a lot of things culturally. It means decreasing global transport costs, increasing communication, so on and so forth. Economically, the question you're going to be asking is free trade. Is that the best policy for your country, for another country? And we've been operating in the United States for a couple of decades on the idea that, yes, it is. You want to have a totally laissez-faire approach to this thing. Now, like most things in capitalism, it's a double-edged sword. There are costs and benefits, and the response, as in most other areas of economics, is you have to make strategic choices. One of my favorite phrases on the subject comes from an economist at Harvard Kennedy School called Danny Roderick, who says the choice is between strategic and unconditional integration with the rest of the world economy. And I favor strategic integration.
Let's actually go to you, Nouriel, because Nancy, I want to come back to the pragmatic way that I think you think about these things for clients. Where do you stand on this issue of globalization, free trade? How much, how little, how bad is it?
Well, I would say my ideological positions are one of a free trader, but I understand there has been a backlash against hyper-globalization. The last 30 years, we have had massive increase in trade in goods and services, in the movement of capital, international migration of labor, data, technology, and information. I think the backlash initially started because there have been winners and losers, both within countries and across countries. Secondly, there has been also this geopolitical depression has led to a fragmentation of the global economy and rivalry among great powers that leads them to de-risking, decoupling, globalization, and you name it. And there's also some sense that maybe losing national sovereignty leads to less democracy and so on. So it's a bit of a backlash against global institutions as well. So I think the combination of all these things is leading to a backlash. I think the globalization has been great for the world. It's led billions of people in poor countries to get out of poverty and getting to middle class throughout the global south. Has done also many good things for advanced economies. And I think that a lot of the losses of jobs in manufacturing were inevitable, have to do more with productivity growth and technology. And I fear that we're going to fight the wars of the past, because technology is going to disrupt many more jobs and industries than anything that globalization has done. So you could close the border, let's say, today, 100% tariffs. We could have nobody entering the United States, but say technology innovation will disrupt millions of jobs more than trade or globalization or migration. So we're fighting the wrong battles at this stage.
Nancy, let's bring you in here on this, because I actually think you might have a point of counterpoint around the manufacturing issues.
First, I'm all for globalization. Clearly, it helped to lift a large part of the world from an income perspective, the emerging economies, to be sure. But there were costs, as you suggested. The costs were the middle part of this country with a gouging out of blue-collar jobs. And in Flint, I was one of 5 that went to a high school. Let me ask first, how many of you grew up in an industrial town with factories? That's probably the most I've seen when I talk to the Wall Street community. I usually am the only one. And so you understand the positive multiplier and you understand the negative multiplier from a factory. And when you shut down factories, it is this black hole. And there was this black hole with China joining WTO in 2001. It even started a little bit under NAFTA in the 1990s. That's when it took down Flint. And so. And I don't blame the EM world for this. I don't blame at all companies for wanting to go where they had a lower cost of producing goods. I blame Washington for not recognizing that this was going on. Our corporate tax rate was near 40%, whereas China's corporate tax rate was 25%. There was something that we could do rather than to encourage young kids to go to college that didn't want to go to college. The kids I grew up with, they were bright. They chose not to go to college. There's nothing wrong with that. Their families worked in factories. They had good jobs, had good income, but that was taken away. And so it's appreciating that it wasn't good for the world that the middle part of the United States was being gouged out. And going forward, I'm much more optimistic. China grew too quickly. The cost of doing business in China by 2010 became too egregious. And manufacturing companies slowly but surely realized, and we've documented this a lot, started to come back to the United States in 2010. And you saw goods producing jobs, manufacturing jobs increase in the United States starting in 2010. Didn't have anything to do with Trump's tax cut or Ryan Trump tax cut in 17. Didn't have anything to do with Biden's CHIPS IRA Act, and certainly doesn't have anything to do with Trump right now. It started back in 2010 because companies are logical. They saw the cost structure go up in China and said, you know, the U.S. has the largest consumer in the world, and if I sell it there and I make it there. And then my friends in Texas told me that, geez, we've got our own energy. China doesn't have energy. We are becoming energy independent. That may be a little bit of an issue today with the data centers, but at the end of the day, the manufacturing renaissance started, and you started to lift goods-producing jobs, manufacturing jobs, construction jobs, mining jobs. You got more people entering the labor market starting in 2010. You saw the poverty rate go down. You saw real median family income go up. I could go on and use a lot more economic potential. GDP growth improved in the United States. Productivity improved prior to 2019.
This question, I mean, let me ask you maybe a finer point there in terms of when you think about the trade-offs, because I think they are. What do we need to learn from the past for the choices? Again, the last panel here, I'll say there was a lot of talk about walking off of cliffs and what will stop us from doing so. Who needs to be in conversation with whom? I think importantly, what data do we need to agree is the kind of data that will inform our choices, and how do we make choices that keep us from the kinds of threats that have come into sharp relief in this past election and in the most recent issues of tariffs and trades. What I'm seeing right now is this growing tension between the conversation about national sovereignty and free trade, or national sovereignty and trade, and how much do we need to be, and in what ways do we need to be self-sufficient, and how much and in what ways do we need to lean in on the ways that we are a part of a global economy. Noriela, let's go to you in terms of some of your thinking about, you said you're more optimistic at the moment, but I'm curious around the issues of national sovereignty that others think about as well, and we'll bring Ian into this conversation as well.
Well, I become a little more optimistic after April 2nd when everybody on Wall Street said we're going to have a US and global recession, that American exceptionalism is over, that the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar is over as well. Because I think people did not realize the constraints that Trump was facing. When he was elected, I wrote a piece saying some of his policy are going to increase growth, reduce inflation, but some of them will be stagflationary. Tariff and protectionism, restrictions of migration, unfunded fiscal deficit, meddling with the independence of the Fed, meddling with the rule of law at home and abroad, trying to have a disorderly weakening of the dollar with a Mar-a-Lago agreement. But I didn't want to be a two-handed economist, say on one hand good, on the other bad. And I said there'd be four major guardrails that are going to constrain him. One is market discipline. The second one is Fed independence. The third one is having some good economic advisors, some of them. And fourth, having a thin majority in Congress. I think the most important was market discipline. Because when he announced this tariff and then he doubled down by attacking the Fed, the stock market went down, bond yields started to go higher, high yield credit spreads went up by over 100%, the dollar started to free fall, and then he went into a panic and realized that there will be a recession, and that the recession will lead him to lose the midterm election. And then his good advisor like Besson told him, do you want to double down or you want to blink? And he decided to blink. Meaning he controls Congress, he controls his party, he controls the Supreme Court, he controls even social media, as his former buddy Elon Musk owns ex-Twitter, but he cannot control the bond vigilantes. I was in the White House when Clinton was president, and Jim Carville, his main advisor, said two important things. One, it's the economy stupid, So if you're not doing something good for the economy, you're going to lose. And guess what? Democrats lost this election in part because there was a rise in inflation after COVID. The second thing he said, jokingly said, if there is a reincarnation, I don't want to be reborn as the President of the United States or the Pope, allegedly the two most powerful people in the world. I want to be reborn as the bond market, so I can go and beat up and intimidate everybody I want. And guess what? The bond vigilante, the stock market vigilantes, the credit vigilantes, the FX vigilantes constrained him. And that's why he had to blink and he had to chicken out.
So it's not the courts.
That's the main constraint.
It's the bond market.
It's the bond market. Those are the most powerful people in the world. And when you do stupid policy, the market punish you. And we got, before actually, everybody talks now about the taco trade. Trump always chickens out. Before the taco trade was the tallow trade. Trump always lashes out, and when he lashes out, then the market punish you, then he chickens out, then he feels like he's a wimp, then he has to lash out again, and then the same cycle occurs over and over again. Now, at the beginning, the markets were overreacting to him lashing out. They were collapsing, and then they were having sign of relief. Oh my God, he's chickening out. But we've seen this cycle for the last 3 months, 3 or 4 times, and now what happens when he lashes out? People say, we know it's going to chicken out, and when he chickens out, there is not market relief because the pricing has already occurred. So I think all of this is noise. If you do stuff that are unsustainable, the market is going to punish you. That was happening in emerging markets. Has happened in the last decade in advanced economies. Greece, Italy, France, UK. This trust did not survive for 44 days. And even US, that is the most powerful country in the world, is subject to market discipline. That's the only thing that matters.
Ian, I think you might have something to weigh in on here.
Sure. The Trump always chickens out dynamic that Nouriel just mentioned, to me, what you're looking at is the fact that this country has had a real policy mess embracing unconstrained free trade. And we have to roll back 50 years of policy mistakes. And that was never going to be a smooth process. It was going to be pretty to look at. There's no clean theoretical model of what you do. There's a very clumsy process that I think is slowly but surely moving in the direction it needs to move in. I would remind people what a mess the New Deal really was. We only remember the achievements. If you actually look back at the history of the Roosevelt administration, there were a lot of false starts. So this country has been living for decades by the myth that ever-increasing free trade is a key to prosperity. Now, if you want to see how things really work, economic history is your friend, because if you look at the economic history of those countries over the last 200, 300 years that have gone from agricultural poverty to being the most advanced economies in the world, and I'm talking about Britain, the United States, Japan, now China, they have not in fact done it by a strategy of free trade. The British were protectionist before they turned to free trade and mysteriously started to decline just about the same time. The United States, for most of its history, was a tariff-protected economy. This goes back to Alexander Hamilton, the guy on the $10 bill. We only walked away from that after World War II for geopolitical reasons having to do with the Cold War. And if you look at countries like Japan and China and a few other formerly poor countries, what Nouriel referred to as countries of the global south that have benefited from globalization, the ones that have succeeded, they have not benefited from globalization in the sense of embrace of free trade. They have benefited from globalization in the sense of taking the openness of developed country markets, above all the United States, as a given for the practice of sophisticated mercantilist strategies in which they themselves do not practice free trade.
Nancy, let me bring you in here because in addition to kind of addressing this issue, some of the prep conversation we had, which will find its way into this, is when you think about the way forward, when you think about what needs to be unlocked, your own assessment of some of the constraints have been the crowding out of private sector growth with what government has done. So I wonder how that comes into this equation as well.
So I would add another headwind to the economy is clearly the size of federal government today as a share of GDP. It's about 24%. It's been that time 3 times in history, during the GFC, during COVID, and World War II. And so we have a very, very high level of government spending in this country. I would add I think there are four major policy responses from this administration. One is dealing with trade. And the tariff aspect, I would argue, is a regressive tax on low, middle-income consumers and is a bad idea. At the same time, I'm for fair trade, which I agree with Ian. There has not been fair trade around the world, from China to Japan to Europe to Brazil. And so if these threats indeed do open the door to fair trade around the world, and the EU today came out with some suggestion maybe they will start to lower tariffs for the United States, maybe there will be some positive out of tariffs. But net, they are a negative, as the last team group highlighted. There will be price shocks, and particularly in the third quarter, as these tariffs do make their way through. Second, they are chipping away at government spending, and I don't think that's being appreciated. Talk to some of the software companies. Talk to some of the defense companies. You are seeing cutting government spending is incredibly emotional. I saw that last week at the healthcare conference. But they are chipping away, and it's not just Medicaid, Medicare they're focusing on. It is technology. It is the defense. It is also the defense industry, and that is really important because that will free up resources for the private sector. Who's more productive? The government? By government, I mean education, healthcare, federal government, and state and local governments. Who's more productive, or the private sector? It's the private sector. So when you reduce resources in the public sector, you free up resources for the private sector. One of my favorite economists was Alberto Alessina, an economist also at Harvard, and he really put the blueprint down for Greece. And one of his main mottos is, when you cut government spending and you look back, the hit to the economy is never as much as you think because it's unproductive. But when you increase taxes, the hit to the economy on the private sector, the hit to the economy is always more egregious than you think because you're squeezing the private sector, which is the more productive area. So along with tariffs, along with deregulation, which was also talked about earlier, you have this path of also trying to chip away, very difficult to do, in government spending. And then the fourth area, and I'll be very quick, no one talked about it at the last session. I was very, very surprised, which is full capital spending, full CapEx expensing of your new investments. I could just talk a half hour on that. But if any of you own any businesses and you're planning on buying new technology, buy it in the next 4 years because you can expense it immediately. And businesses are the backbone of this economy. It's not the consumer. If businesses don't invest, if they don't improve their productivity, if they don't improve their profitability, they're not going to be able to hire anybody. Go to Germany and see what their unemployment rate is. It's 6%. They don't innovate. They don't allow companies to fire anybody, and therefore companies don't make any money. A few companies are making money today because of all the defense spending, but our economy has this backbone of profitability. It's called a business cycle for a reason, because businesses actually are the backbone because they hire people. The consumer is not the backbone, companies are. And these policies, I think, are net positive for the business community.
So that's a lot,
Yeah.
and I think that, following this. Yeah, I'm trying to translate a little bit right now for us around when you are not the large company, Fortune 500 America company, and you are that consumer, and you're trying to make sense of the decisions and the choices and the pace of change right now. I don't think a lot of people are feeling particularly better off or optimistic at the moment vis-a-vis the past. In terms of what has changed for them in the last year of time. But I'm curious, when we think about the long run options of that, what's the toolbox in that? How does that need to change? So I want to give you a chance, Nouriel, to jump in on these two pieces of conversation and define your sense of the role of trade. Where does value come from in an economy? And then I also want to say, do we have to choose value for the company, value for the household? Are these trade-offs, or can you do both of these things together, and what's the policy that gets us there?
Well, the way I would answer it is that I recently said that tech trumps tariff. And what do I mean by that? I mean, we're in the middle of the most important technological revolution in human history. And if you look at the industries of the future, a dozen of them, whether it's AI, machine learning, robotic automation, semiconductor, quantum, biomedical research, space exploration and exploitation, defense tech, green tech, ag tech, fintech, cryptography, about a dozen of them. US is number one in almost all of them. China's ahead only in green tech, EVs, and maybe batteries. Europe and everybody else is not even number 3 or 4, they're number 8, 10, and so on. And US is ahead in all this technology of the future, and that's why I've said Trump tech trumps tech, because by the end of this decade, US economic growth, because of this technology of the future, is going to be at least 4%. Already today, people say it's 1.8. It's not 1.8. It's closer to 3%. The last 2 years, we had growth almost at 3%, in spite of the Fed tightening. So,
and you think that's going to happen?
We've seen a doubling of productivity growth since 2019.
Do you think that's going to continue to happen if the tariffs go into place? Do you think it's
yeah,
gonna happen?
because if you make the estimates of the maximum pain that tariff and restriction migration impose on potential growth is 50 basis points, while the impact of technology on growth is going to go from 2% to 4, 200 basis points. So it's a ratio of 4 to 1, 200 versus 50. And by the way, even our migration policy and trade policy are not going to be as bad. So tech trumps tariff, and it doesn't matter who's going to be in the White House. I've said you could have Mickey Mouse in the White House, and because of the dynamism of the US private sector, US is going to have an economic boom. But what's the consequence of the economic boom? Because you have an investment boom in the United States and private and public savings are low, you will have an even bigger current account deficit, because the investment boom leads to high economic growth and job creation. I think people get totally confused, the correlation between growth and economic trade. They think that because of unfair trade practices or currency of the rest of the world, we have a trade deficit that destroys industry, destroys jobs with low economic growth. It's just the opposite. It has been growing faster than any advanced economy, Europe, Japan, Germany, UK, for the last 20 years. And guess what? All these countries are running, with the exception of UK, a trade surplus, and US is running a trade deficit. Why is that the case? If you have an investment boom and you don't have enough savings, you have to borrow from the rest of the world to finance that investment boom. And that investment boom allows you to grow faster. So like, take a small firm that has a new technology. You don't have domestic saving, internal savings. You don't have revenue and profits, but you have an investment boom. What do? You borrow, either debt or equity, so you're allowed to grow faster, so you have high economic growth, you have job creation, and therefore a larger trade deficit causes more economic growth and more job creation. And that's what's going to happen in the United States. You could have any tariff in the US. Right now, it doesn't matter. You'll have an investment boom, you'll have an economic growth boom, and you'll have a technological boom, you'll have a job growth boom. That's the reality. You'll have a bigger trade deficit, not a smaller one, but that allows us to grow faster.
But
People
that's
don't
actually
understand this
exactly,
causality.
I would say, Ian, that's a little bit of what you actually feel like we need an industrial policy to counter, is the deficit of, like, maybe paint out a little bit more of the, what you would put in relief about what Nouriel just said about what, like, is it all win-win regardless of how the government response is to a growing trade deficit, if everything is going in that direction, as Nouriel says?
You know, I've been reading Nouriel's stuff for years, but I have to respectfully disagree with a very big chunk of what he just said. To start with, the idea that the United States has this huge technological advantage over the rest of the world, you got to be very careful about asserting that. For example, not one of the 10 leading robotics companies in the world are American. Now, do you think robotics is an important technology for the future? I don't know. What do you think? Other thing I'd point out is, look at vehicles. China is way ahead of everybody else in the transition to electric vehicles, which is going to have to take place. Europe is ahead of us at the same time that the United States is doubling down on legacy technologies with the internal combustion engine. It's like we were building steam locomotives rather than diesel locomotives 75 years ago. So these are issues with, if you think the US is just way ahead in technology. Now, with respect to the arguments that Nouriel just made about the trade deficit and where that comes from, I think he's correct that the trade deficit is ultimately driven by a number of things. One of the biggest things that's important is an inflow of foreign capital, which pushes up the dollar, makes it cheaper for Americans to import, harder for Americans to export. You get a trade deficit. Now, the problem with that is unlike the happy picture that Nouriel was just explaining, where we're pulling in capital from the rest of the world because we have these great technologies, we have these great companies, we have these great investment opportunities, and the whole world wants to be a part of it. If you look at foreign capital inflows into the United States, a very small part of it is greenfield FDI. A very small part of it is venture capital. It's mostly just portfolio investment driven by the fact that we have large, stable, secure financial markets and we have the world's reserve currency. That's what's actually happening. And the problem with running a trade deficit is threefold. Number one, in the short run, you destroy jobs because the cars are being made in Yokohama by Toyota rather than in Flint, Michigan by General Motors. Number two, you destroy productive capacity, which means not only are you losing physical plant, you're losing the embodied know-how and the learning by doing and the people who know how to do things. I mean, there's no one in America who can make flat panel displays these days because we lost the predecessor industry, liquid crystal displays. And the third thing you're doing when you run a chronic trade deficit, year-to-year fluctuations I don't care about, but when it's huge trade deficit year after year after year, what you're doing is you're consuming more than you produce as a country. Now, unless you're trading with Santa Claus at the North Pole, there's only three ways to do this. You can either pay foreigners with goods you produce today, which means we import Toyota cars and export Boeing aircraft, which is good, which is what should happen. Or when you run a trade deficit, you're either selling off your existing assets. That is, we pay for all these imports by foreigners buying shares of Microsoft, limited partnership in a shopping center in Denver, you name it. And then number three is we go into debt to foreign nations. And the US now has the worst net international investment position in the world, and it continues to deteriorate. Now, what's the problem with selling off assets? What's the problem with going into debt? The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is just arithmetic. When you own less and you owe more, you are, by simple accounting definitions, poorer than you otherwise would have been.
Nancy. Oh, Nancy.
I can give a positive spin on this.
Well, I know, and I'm just, that's why I'm looking at you so
Okay.
gratefully.
So
No,
first, Japan
seriously,
is one of the biggest manufacturers of robotics. The Japanese economy is a mess. I've studied Japan for decades, and I was bullish from 2012 through 21, 22, and now I've turned very cautious on the Japanese economy. It's a very, in any event, so just because Japan has robotics doesn't mean they're a technological innovator. How many of you had one of those Sony things? I mean, I had a Toshiba. Toshiba actually made the first iPad, and I had it. And then the Betamax, I don't know what those things are, your TVs, and they lost that too. And so Japan is not a technological innovator. They happen to have robotics. We are at the forefront, I agree with Nouriel, we are at the forefront of new technological innovation. TV flat panel screens, you can buy. I tried to give away a TV a couple of months ago. No one wanted it because they're now so cheap. You want to stay in the forefront of high-end technological innovation, which is what the United States has. And that's how you improve productivity, that's how you improve profitability, and that's how you then help to create new jobs that, to be sure, will be destroyed with this technological innovation. That's been going on for over a century in this country. The Industrial Revolution. Flint, Michigan, when there were automotive plants being built in Flint, there were riots in town where they made horse and buggies. Go look it up. When you transition from airline pilots from railroad engineers, there were protests. And so technological innovation is creative destruction, but if you don't embrace it, you lose, which is what you see in Japan, and it's what you see in Europe, to be sure.
We're going to come to questions in just a minute, so be thinking if you have yours, and then we'll do a final wrap-up together on this, I would say, one chapter of an ongoing conversation we should be having in this country to think about what are the systemic risks around investment, around the cycle, the virtuous cycle of what people have talked about for the point of an economy. What is an economy for? Who is it for? I think Ian makes an interesting point. If we're optimistic in the long run, but there's incredible transition in terms of what kinds of industries give you a positive outlook, Nouriel. The amount of transition and the impact that's going to have on households and the ways that gets managed and the ways that we invest in that, I think is going to be something that we'll need to understand all of these mechanics to grapple with. I think you all have some interesting ideas on that as well. I'm going to come back at the end to ask you all, because I think you talk about Mickey Mouse, doesn't matter who's in the White House. For you, it was Santa Claus, and it's not going to matter, in terms of who can you trade with and gain value. But I think overall, as we're grappling with what does the economy of tomorrow look like, and for whom will it be? Will anybody in the country, at a consumer level, be feeling the gains that you all feel will come if we get these decisions right? And I think that this is the underlying question for people who sit in another tent at this exact moment, is they're feeling the growing divide, the growing economic divide around who's benefiting from an economy that's been growing. And it really has led to some of the additional kind of backlash in terms of the volatility of politics. And if we leave this to politicians, we heard in the last one that it's Governor Kern said that they will wait until they are at the cliff to make a decision. So I think we're in some ways it feels like we're tying our hands about this in ways that we perhaps needn't. Let me see if there's questions in the audience for folks. And where's our mic runner? I see there's a hand here with Brian, and then we're going to come to two over there. I'm going to go ahead and I see the pink. If we can get them, we will. But go ahead and ask yours, and I might take a couple before we answer.
Yeah, the one thing that always puzzles me is we're a service economy. I mean, manufacturing is less than 8% of employment. How come we never hear, we were talking about the trade deficit, but it's not that we import cheap goods and export Boeings, it's we export software, financial services. So how come in these conversations our service sector surplus is never mentioned? I mean, isn't that a pretty important piece?
It's a great question. I asked that question last night, and it was such a long answer, I avoided asking it today, but I think we should come to it. And then over here, there was a question there, and then there's a woman in glasses up in front.
So one of the things that I don't think has been mentioned is the way our federal system is set up so that people can vote with their feet, and you have 50 different experiments going on, social, economic, financial, amongst the various states competing for capital. And to me, that seems to be a saving grace for people, particularly in lower middle income families, who can vote with their feet and find those states where, some of the things that are going on in other places where a lower middle class family and middle class family can't get a break because costs are too high. So I'm wondering, from the panel, what do you think about the architecture, leaving aside politics, the architecture of the United States in having a federal system that allows for this kind of competition to create ultimately upward mobility, even if it's absent in certain areas of the country that have become rigidified?
Thank you. So we've got a big piece about the service economy. We've got an underlying hypothesis that we have a highly mobile population in the U.S. that could make choices and move. And let's take a third and with one of the glasses there, and you can choose your own adventure. We'll try to navigate through these quickly.
I have a tariff question, which I feel like I heard.
Free and fair trade.
I think that the gentleman had it right. I mean, we run a trade deficit in goods, we're running a large and growing trade surplus in services, and the economy is becoming more services. If you look at the technology of the future, many of them, starting with AI, Gen AI, you name it, have to do with services. And services apply to everything, from transportation to financial technologies to varieties of manufacturing processes and so on. And I think that therefore the emphasis on jobs in manufacturing, if you look at the losses in manufacturing jobs that occur in the United States, most of them have been driven by technological innovation. Same thing happened with agriculture. With increasing productivity, we need less people to do more production, and therefore people move from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services. And the future of the US is comparative advantage in the technology of the future, in services, and the integration between, by the way, software and hardware, because humanoid robots.
You're going to find out why
the most jobs
I
are gonna
avoided
be
this
there.
till the end,
Can
but I want to
I-
hear a highlight for this one,
No,
and then
no.
we'll meet up in the
I don't
end.
disagree. The data are the data. But at the same time, for every manufacturing jobs, 6 non-manufacturing jobs are created, which is why I described my family history the way I did. And so we need manufacturing jobs in this country. I think the UK is another great example where they need and they recognize they need manufacturing jobs. Not to the same extent we did in the past because of innovation, but not everybody wants to work in the service sector. You're hearing more and more young people who actually want to go in and become electricians and more kind of goods producing jobs.
Any take on the mobility that kind of, in some ways, that I would say what your question was is a little bit of the free trade and free choice of America itself as a set of trading partners.
The architecture,
Yeah.
the architecture of the country, the federal system, is designed to create
Yep.
competition between the 50 states. And does that offer hope to create the upward mobility which may not exist in certain traditional centers?
So I don't know if there's a quick take or an opinion there, Ian.
Sure. The thing you have to, I begin by saying I do agree with you that the federal system, not at the state level, but also at the local level, is a big plus for this country precisely because it does induce a certain amount of jurisdictional competition. I live in San Francisco. I spent most of my adult life in New York City, and I'm well aware of the dysfunction of the governments there. And if you're an ordinary American, you can't buy a house there, but you can move someplace in Texas. You're going to have a nice life. That's all great. The one or two points I would make is, number one, I don't know if you're aware of this, but U.S. mobility is actually at an all-time low since World War II. It's been going down and down and down recently. It's not been going up. And the other thing is that there's a huge disconnect between where a lot of economic opportunities are located and where people can and cannot move. If you work and live in Toledo, Ohio, and there are opportunities being created in Boston or in San Francisco, you can't move there because you can't afford the housing. Now, the economist Ed Glazer at Harvard has written about this a bit and has talked about how this is a huge constraint, actually, on American economic growth. That is where the opportunities are, where you have the opportunity to grow high-value industries, and then housing costs just kill that. But you're going to have to talk to him for the details.
Yeah. I'm going to wrap us up, and with that, I'm going to come back to your excellent question and put a little bit of a twist on it, which is you asked a little bit about how do we make it? Can we do it without as much disruption? Is there an easier way? I would say if you're advising, and this is, I'm thinking about the Economist Hour. There was an era where economic advisors really did drive the decisions of policymakers and politicians. I think that's a question right now. I think it's in flux. But if you did hold the power and the pen and could make one decision that would make it the outcome of a continued or even a growing prosperity more assured in this country, what would be the thing that you would advise to a leader, a young leader who has a long life ahead of them with a lot of volatility? What would you advise? You're doing a lot of advising these days. What's an easy?
That's me.
Yeah. What's easy? What makes it?
Well, among other things, I'm a professor, and they ask me always if I'm a young student, what should I study? Because, life expectancy will be over 100 years, and you have to have a legitimate job for the next 60, 80 years or whatever. When you're going to enter the labor force, we're going to live until 100 or 120, if David Sinclair is right. I would say you have to understand technology. Probably you have to major in something like STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, computer science. Doesn't mean you need to code, because the AI is going to do the code. Maybe you want to minor still in liberal arts to know how to think critically, read and write, and so on. But you have to be aware of technology, because technology is going to make most jobs, more sectors, more industry obsolete. And therefore, as a young person, you have to really understand how technology is going to affect.
And I will qualify it, I'll
and
say, as we
reinvent
finish,
yourself. So-
a young person that is making economic decisions that will implicate the trajectories of lives of hundreds and thousands of people. So we'll go ahead and say another thing, and we'll wrap up here, and we can follow up.
Sure. The reality is that nations are governed by a political process. So you're very rarely going to get a clean, technocratic solution to the problem. If you want to know what Platonic guardians would do, Mark Festo, it's my co-authors right here. Want to stand up, Mark?
All right,
My
Mark,
co-author, the
there you are.
Well, in our book, Industrial Policy for the United States, the final chapter does spec out what, Platonic guardians might do. But it's complicated, but we felt we owed people an answer, though, of course, that's not the way the world works. In terms of what one policy thing I would do, I would get serious about the overvalued dollar by imposing a small variable charge on inflows of foreign capital into the United States, which is wrecking our international competitiveness.
Nancy.
I do three things: give more money to the private sector via tax policy, continue to do the deregulation that we're doing, and continue to chip away at government spending, providing more resources for the private sector.
The one thing I didn't hear this time that I heard last time was divine intervention. I appreciate that from you all. Please thank our panel. Thank you so much.